Alright, yeah, welcome back to some more Magic Arena, and we're going to be doing a weekly series today, starting up with our Izzet Turn 4 Niv control deck. So, this kind of speaks for itself on its name. We are going to be trying to cast Niv-Mizzet Peyrune on turn 4. So, Niv-Mizzet is a 6-mana legendary creature, 5/5 with flying, that cannot be countered. Now, it is incredibly hard to cast in most decks, due to its triple blue and triple red mana cost. But because what is it, of course, it's going to be quite easy to do so, and we have many other ways of casting this as well to fix our mana. So the idea behind Niv is whenever you draw a card, it deals 1 damage to any target. This is our primary win con. We want to be drawing a fair few cards, but we can also draw cards outside of random spells. Whenever a player casts an instant or sorcery spell, we get to draw then. So, if our opponent tries to remove Niv-Mizzet, then we draw a card. If our opponent counters one of our spells, we draw a card. If we counter a spell, we draw a card. So it turns all of our instant and sorceries into cantrips at that point, which is pretty solid. And every single time we do that, we hit our opponent for 1. So we're going to try and get Niv-Mizzet down on turn 4, and then on turns 5 or 6, we're going to close out the game and win. That's basically what Niv-Mizzet does. He is a must-answer threat. If you don't answer him, you will lose. That is the idea. So how do we get him down on turn 4, since he is a 6-mana creature? Well, we have the other threat in the deck, which is Sarkhan Fireblood, a 3-mana, 3-loyalty planeswalker, 1 and double red. You get to discard a card and then draw a card with his tick up, which synergizes quite well with Niv-Mizzet, because of course we'll get rid of the crap that we don't really want, which is good for a control deck as well, because we might hit a flood of lands and therefore Sarkhan can discard that. We could also hit some jumpstart cards as well, like Radical Idea or Chemisters, and therefore we still gain a little bit of value from those because we can cast them from the graveyard. But the way that we cast Niv-Mizzet is actually from his second tick up. His other +1 adds 2 mana in any combination of colours, and then you can spend this mana only to cast dragon spells. So we can play Sarkhan down on turn 3. On turn 4, we play our 4th land, tick up Sarkhan to make 2 mana, that gives us 6 mana, and then we get Niv-Mizzet down. Now, it doesn't allow us to actually protect Niv-Mizzet, so if our opponent does have an answer, then of course they can kill Niv-Mizzet, but what we end up having there is our opponent redrawing, giving us a redraw off of killing Niv-Mizzet anyway, and even if they do kill it, we still have a Sarkhan ticking up, and we can work towards his ultimate instead. So his ultimate is -7, it's not too hard to get there, it doesn't take us very long at all, and it creates 4 5/5 red dragon creature tokens with flying, so 20 points of damage in total. And if we've dealt any kind of damage along the way using things like Shock or Lightning Strike or Ionize, then we don't even need all 4 of the dragons. So if they have one creature in the air, then we can just go around it and usually win that way. So this is a wonderful little combination of cards where, you know, even if they do manage to answer it, they've only really answered half of the problem. As I mentioned as well, Sarkhan is very powerful just in a control deck alone because of the looting effect. You could think of Sarkhan's +1 as kind of a miniature Search for Azcanta, you know? Search for Azcanta, a 2-mana legendary enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, you get to look at the top card of your library, and then you can put it into your graveyard. And if you have 7 more cards in your graveyard, then you get to transform it into Azcanta the Sunken Ruin. So the same looting effect that we get from Search for Azcanta on our upkeep is kind of what Sarkhan does anyway. If we draw a card and we really don't like it, say it's a land and we've already got 6, then we can just discard it and redraw it. We add to our graveyard, which helps out Search for Azcanta, and we draw a little bit deeper into our deck as well to find all of the answers that we need. So Sarkhan is as much of a threat to our opponent as is Niv-Mizzet, but Niv-Mizzet is the answer that they need to deal with right away. And as we mentioned, there's a lot of ways where our opponent just ends up giving us a redraw, so we don't really lose too much by having Niv-Mizzet die in the exchange. If they go for like Vraska's Contempt, we just draw a card. So we've replaced Niv-Mizzet already, and our opponent's a card down. So card advantage against the control decks, right? It's pretty good. Pretty good indeed. So, to combo with Niv-Mizzet, we are going to be using a lot of card draw spells just to find him quite easily, as well as a few burn spells along the way. So we have 4 copies of Opt, which is a 1-mana instant speed, scry 1, and then draw a card. So we get to look at the top card of our library, either put it at the bottom or keep it, and then draw it. So it's pretty good stuff, and with Niv-Mizzet, The draw deals an extra damage because of his first ping ability right there. And the fact that we cast an opt is also a draw. So this is actually a 1 mana draw 2 with a scry 1 attached to it, which is pretty sweet. Shock is also a 1 mana deal 3 and draw a card at that point, so we're getting some very good value there. It's also very important, these shocks and lightning strikes, to keep Sarkhan alive, because if you do want to have turn 4 Niv-Mizzet, you actually have to have Sarkhan survive on turn 3 leading into turn 4. So the early game we want to be having burn spells in hand if it's a creature matchup. We want to have burn spells in hand that allow us to basically keep 4 power off of the board. As long as our opponent does not have 4 power on board, then Sarkhan is very likely to survive long enough just to get Niv-Mizzet in play. And that's basically all he really needs to do. He is the Dragon Lord himself, so he will be bringing in, he'll be going all out to just get Niv-Mizzet in play, so it's pretty sweet. And of course, looting with the tick up, allowing us to find him a lot easier as well. We have 2 copies of Negate just for extra little bits of removal. If we want to go a little bit later into the game and hold Niv-Mizzet a wee bit longer, then we might actually want a 2 mana counter spell for the removal that they have. So if we want to cast him a little bit later, maybe in the late game we want to just hard cast him on like turn 8, then we have Niv-Mizzet plus Negate to keep him safe. And as we mentioned, if Niv-Mizzet survives the turn and you have a counterspell in hand, the likelihood is that you've just won the game on the spot, which is pretty sweet. So that's why we're running 2 copies of Negate in here. It's not always the most powerful card in the matchup, but there are plenty of decks right now where Negate is very powerful. Esper control is very, very strong in the format right now, so we're going to be seeing a lot of it. So Negate just gets its value anyway. But we also have a few other counterspells as well. Sinister Sabotage as a 2 of, 3 mana instant speed, counter target spell, and Surveil one, which Surveil basically is a scry, but we put it into our graveyard instead of the bottom of our deck, which is more powerful than scrying actually, because of Searcher's Canter. Speaking of, we didn't really touch upon the flip side of this, as Canter the Sunken Ruin is a blue legendary land, but it allows us to pay 3, look at the top 4 cards of our library, and reveal a non-creature, non-land card from among them, and put it into your hand, the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. The only downside to this card is that it cannot actually find one half of our combo. We can't actually find Niv-Mizzet with it, but we can find Sarkhan if we do need it, as well as all of the counter magic. So it does come with a little bit of downside, a little bit of a kind of Nombo-esque kind of thing, so you want to be careful when you do use Azcanta that you don't bottom all of your Niv-Mizzets, because we don't have a great deal of ways to shuffle our deck, unfortunately. So if they go to the bottom, you're going to have to wait until you just draw them naturally. So got to keep that in mind. But for the most part, Azcanta in a control mirror is super powerful nonetheless, and we will be primarily using it anyway to find removal and counter spells. So not hitting Niv-Mizzet's not the end of the world anyway. But yes, that's why Surveil is a little bit more powerful than Scry. We also have Ionize, and Ionize is 1 blue and a red instant speed, counter target spell, and then deal 2 damage to that spell's controller. Now, you might have heard that Ionize is not as good as Sinister Sabotage, which is very true in certain cases. You want to be thinking about the 2 damage there when you actually weigh up this card, as the 2 damage, is it better than Sinister Sabotage's Surveil? And I think in this particular list it is, but in most cases it probably isn't. The idea behind this 2 damage is just to make sure that on turn 5, if we do get that combo off, that this control spell is dealing extra damage. This it turns into a lightning strike that counters a spell at that point. So it allows us just to close out the game a lot quicker, because we really don't want our opponent to be getting the opportunity to just draw into extra removal spells for Niv-Mizzet. We want to be able to untap on turn 5, hold up in a counter spell, and that just be the end of the game. So the damage here is basically our way of racing our opponent. So it's just a little bit better in that case. But if you are on a budget, there is absolutely no reason why you can't just run some extra Sinister Sabotages over Ionize. That's something I do want to touch upon with this deck as well. It is actually kind of budget friendly. It does go over a little bit of the budget, of course, compared to my budget series, which is like 6 rares and 4 mythics. But the actual main combo of the deck is 4 rares and 4 mythics, and every other rare in this deck is either interchangeable, like Ionize can just be Sinister Sabotage, or cancels if it really comes to it. And then Search for Azcanta is another 2 rares here, but this is a staple in control matchup and in control decks, so this is something that you want to be investing your wildcards in anyway if you haven't already done so. I'm not entirely sure if the new player decks include a Search for Azcanta in them. I think they might have one, but I'm not entirely sure on that one. But even then, you know, this is something that you should be investing your wildcards in regardless if you are into control. Same thing kind of goes for the mana base. We have 4 Steam Vents and 4 Sulphur Falls. We want to have as many jewels in this deck as possible so that we can cast Niv-Mizzet on turn 6 guaranteed. So we do actually run 2 Highland Lakes in the deck just to make sure that that is going to happen, because we don't really want to hit a big bundle of like islands and mountains singularly. We want to have a nice even split, so that's why I'm running 2 Highland Lakes. But if you are on a budget and you've not quite got there with your dual lands, one, I do highly recommend that you do invest your wildcards in these, because they are very important in the standard environment to have a really good mana base. But if you don't have all of them, then you can put your 4 Highland Lakes in if you really want to. It will hurt the deck, but at the same time, it will still allow you to play this deck all the same. So, we have 1 copy of Fiery Cannonade in here. It's one of the few singular cards in this list. Fiery Cannonade is a 3 mana board wipe. It's the best that we really have available to us right now. Red kind of sucks for board wipes, unfortunately, short of Star of Extinction, which kind of actively hurts the deck. Fiery Cannonade is our best option for creature-based decks. Now, this actually might want to go up to a 2 of in this list, because just lately I've been seeing a lot of aggro decks in best of 3, which is not something we usually see. But I'm running 1 in the main just as a bit of a catch-all for that kind of situation. For the most part, we just want to deal with a mid-rangey kind of creature base, which is why we've got the Shocks and the Lightning Strikes as our form of removal. But if we come against a go-wide strategy, like mono-red or tokens or something like that, then Fiery Cannonade dealing 2 damage to each non-pirate creature is sure to get a pretty good sweep on our opponent. But as I mentioned, you might want to go up one of these if you are seeing aggro as much as I am at the moment, actually. It's a bit strange, the meta at the moment. I don't really understand it, but it's getting a little bit more aggressive, so maybe this wants to be a 2 of. We currently have the others in the sideboard anyway, just to shore up that matchup. So if we do end up coming against aggro, we have 4 copies of Cannonade in games 2 and 3, so we should be in a pretty good spot. We also have 1 Radical Idea. It's just a bit of a slot filler, to be honest. You could really exchange this with a lot of things, but I like the idea of having a 2 mana draw with Jumpstart as well, because it works quite nicely with Niv-Mizzet. Allows us to dig through the deck, so I think we did want a cantrip in this slot, but of course we can't really have a 5th copy of Opt, and I don't think like Charter Course or anything like that is really worthwhile. But yeah, this is kind of a flex slot here. We also have Beacon Bolt as our final piece of removal, and it is a solid piece of removal as well, because it's going to be our big removal, our tall removal. So 3 mana sorcery, Beacon Bolt deals damage to target creature equal to the number of instant and sorcery cards you own in exile and in your graveyard. So you might notice that our removal spells at the moment only take care of creatures with 3 toughness. So if we come across a creature that has 4 toughness, or maybe even higher than that, like a Doom Whisperer or something like that, Beacon Bolt is our answer to it. And it's also reusable as well, because it does have Jumpstart, which means we can discard a card from our hand to recast it all over again. Our deck is primarily instants and sorceries as well. We are running 24 instants and 2 sorceries, so this thing is going to be able to hit all of the biggest things in the format. This could probably take down a 20-20 in the late game if the game's gone on that long. And you probably have something like Niv-Mizzet in play alongside it, so you can use those pings to just get your extra bit of value in. But this often, on average, I think ends up running about 14 damage from what I've seen and what I've played. I've played a fair bit with this deck and it's been doing quite well, so Beacon Bolt seems like a solid inclusion in this list. We have Chemist's Insight as our card draw of choice as well. 4 mana, instant speed, draw 2 cards, and then Jumpstart. Again, we can discard a card from our hand if it's like a land or something that's not very useful, like a Shock against a control deck. And we can just draw extra cards to allow us to find our counter spells and things like that. And that's essentially the deck, guys. Let's go to the sideboard, shall we? 2 copies of Blink of an Eye. We're running these ones for Ixalan's Binding, because Ixalan's Binding is not something that we can really deal with. If they hit on Niv-Mizzet or Sarkhan, we're going to have a bad time. So we want to be able to blink that spell so that we can counter it later down the line with our Sabotages or Ionizes. and it just allows us to just get our value right on back. So blink of an eye in here, if that is indeed the case. It's going to be difficult for us to win through it, so just having 2 copies there is quite nice. Of course, we do have 2 win cons. We have the Sarkhan ult, and we have Niv-Mizzet just doing his thing. Just doing Niv-Mizzet things, so as long as we have 1, we should be okay, but it's very nice to just have a catch for the Ixalan's Binding all the same. It's not an overly popular card because of Mortify at the moment, so you see it on occasion but not very often, but it's something that we want to keep an eye on anyway. 2 copies of Negate for the Control Mirror. Esper is turning up quite a lot at the moment, so a 2-mana counter absolutely everything as far as Esper is concerned is pretty sweet. So we want to be running that one. It also allows us to bring down Niv-Mizzet a little bit early if we choose not to bring him down on turn 4 with our Sarkhan combo. So we can bring him down on like turn 8 if the game's gone on that long enough, which in a control mirror it should absolutely do so. So we can bring that down with Negate backup, which is pretty nice. We can also use Sarkhan's +1 for extra mana to bring him down a little bit earlier than that and kind of do the turn 4 Niv thing, but have Negate backup because we've spent the 2 mana from Sarkhan to cast Niv-Mizzet, so it's pretty sweet all the same. Lava Coil to take care of mid-range decks that might use Fine Finality. It's also a little bit of a taller removal spell as well if we come across any 4 toughness creatures, Nicol Boluses and things like that. So Lava Coil is a bit more catch-all. It's also good for the aggro decks as well because you can just include more removal for them instead of counter magic, because if you are up against an aggro matchup, you don't really want to be countering as much as just removing, really. So it's a cheaper counter spell, you could kind of call it that, in an aggro situation. 2 copies of Sorcerer's Spyglass for Teferi. Primary reason for running this one. The second copy could hit Azcanta the Sunken Ruin if you're not interested in running your own, but something to keep in mind that this is symmetrical, so if you do want to name Azcanta, then you are going to block your own one from being activated. So if you are naming Azcanta as well, make sure to hit the land side of it. It's very important because this card has 2 different names, and Sorcerer's Spyglass only stops a card with a single name, so you have to actually name the land side of it. But primarily, you want to just be hitting Teferi. Secondarily, probably Kaya is another one that you could hit, and then Karn maybe is a tertiary option, but Azcanta, if it comes down to it, is a fine option all the same, you know. If you don't have an Azcanta of your own and your opponent does, then it is best to just hit Azcanta all the same, because if you can't have Azcanta, nobody can, so there is that. The other 2 copies of Sinister Sabotage are in here as well. Again, for the control matchup, just making sure that we have answers to absolutely everything that they do. We end up bringing in enough counter spells to win the counter wars 9 times out of 10. And it's just really nice to have Niv-Mizzet come down with counter magic backup anyway. You want to keep in a few removal spells against the Esper mid-range, Esper control matchup, sorry. It is a little bit of a trap to fall into when you go into sideboarding and you see control running just like Teferi as their win con, just to take out the lightning strikes and the shocks. That is incorrect. You shouldn't actually do that, because your opponents will bring in Lyras, Thief of Sanities, and Chromiums and things like that, so you need to be able to actually have removal to answer that. So we want to keep in things like Beacon Bolt and Lightning Strike against the Esper control matchups, but certainly take out the shocks if you really feel like doing that. That's not necessarily one that needs to go down, but you have to be able to answer a turn 3 Thief of Sanity, otherwise in the Esper mid-range, Esper control matchup, you're just going to lose on the spot, so something to keep in mind there. As I mentioned, 3 copies of Fiery Cannonade for the aggro matchup, bringing us to a grand total of 4 board wipes in the deck for aggro, and it can be cast at instant speed as well, something I haven't really touched upon, but you can end step or even combat step this Fiery Cannonade so that your opponent commits to the board before you wipe the board, and then you get to untap and do whatever you need to do. So it's really nice to get like Sarkhan down on turn 4 onto a clean board after you've cannonaded, something like that. It's pretty solid. Finally, a little bit of a questionable inclusion, but honestly, it's the best of a bad situation kind of card. 1 copy of Star of Extinction, 5 and double red, 7 mana total for a sorcery speed, destroy target land, and Star of Extinction deals 20 damage to each creature and each planeswalker. So this actually does hurt us as well as our opponent. It will kill Niv-Mizzet and Sarkhan. Killing planeswalkers and creatures is kind of its job, but in like Sultai and Golgari mid-range matchups, our opponents can run something like Carnage Tyrant, and it is a very big problem card. It's not something that Izzet can actually deal with, because Carnage Tyrant is, one, uncounterable, so our Ionizers and Sinister Sabotages cannot stop it. Two, it is also quite big, which means our Lightning Strikes and Shocks couldn't stop it. And three, it's hexproof, which means we can't even target it with our Shocks, Lightning Strikes, and Beacon Bolts, even if we wanted to. So it's not something that we can deal with once it's down, but we want to be trying to maybe race our opponent by getting Niv-Mizzet down soon. If we get Niv-Mizzet down on turn 4 before our opponent can Carnage Tyrant, it's not a problem, but we want to bring in Star of Extinction on the off chance that they do manage to resolve that card, because Niv-Mizzet can't block it profitably, and it will just run away with the game since we can't deal with it with any of our removals. So it becomes a race as soon as Carnage Tyrant hits the field. So Star of Extinction is coming in for that reason as well. So that's essentially the deck, guys. I do recommend playing this one. It's a lot of fun, actually. We played it on stream a few days ago, and I think we ended up going 5-1, maybe 5-2, something like that, in the best of 3s that we were playing. So it did insanely well, getting many Niv-Mizzets down on turn 4 and just winning on the spot. I did play it later on in the day as well, though, and came across an absurd amount of aggro, and it did not too great against that one, but we're not really just expecting aggro all that much, because it's just not a matchup you see every day, though. It is changing, and that's exactly why I mentioned earlier that you might want an extra copy of Fiery Cannonade in the main, if it actually does end up being a thing, and mono red and things like that start invading best of 3. It's certainly a counterable matchup to go against, so you might want to tweak your sideboard in your main if aggro does end up showing up as much as it has been recently. But for the most part, this should be pretty good against the mid-range lists. Reasonable against the control matchups. I think we've got about a 50-50 win rate against those kind of decks. If they just don't answer Niv-Mizzet, they lose on the spot, that kind of thing. So it's been a lot of fun. It's been doing pretty decent. And yeah, just chaining Niv-Mizzet together on a very early board state is absurd, and I absolutely love it. Hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you did, then be sure to hit that like button and subscribe. If you wait around till the end of the video, there will be a link on the end card that will take you to the first matchup with this deck. I hope you guys enjoy that one, and yeah, I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.